Luke, can you see me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. So Dorothea is also with us.
Yes, I can hear and see you now.
Perfect. So we're waiting for Benjamin. Am I right? Or is he already waiting in the waiting room?
Okay.
Luke, could you also put Benjamin on the panelist list?
Yeah, is that Ben Luke?
Ben,
yeah,
exactly.
Got it.
So now you have to inform us. Sorry for being late, Dorothea and Ben. We had some technical problems, but are we already online on live stream, or do we have still 2 or 3 minutes time to have a
so
short briefing?
Participants are coming in, so there's so we've got participants already. So your chat now is to the audience.
Okay. Dorothea and Ben, could you put your videos on so we see if, okay, perfect. It's nice to have you with us, even if it's a bit weird. Do you have any questions before we start the event to us, or will it work for you?
It's okay.
It's okay?
Hi.
Yeah, just start.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this third event of our Workers Without Borders event series on the working conditions of migrant workers in the EU during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm very, very happy to have you as participants on Zoom with us, but also our viewers on of our live stream on social media, and especially today our two panelists, Dorothea Biabak-Anon and Benjamin Luc, and to just give a short outline of what we are doing at the moment here at European Alternatives, also with our partner, Another Europe is Possible, who are hosting this event tonight. Workers Without Borders is a project where we are trying to do research and advocacy and investigate the labor struggles of migrant workers inside and outside the EU, and also what we're trying is to seek direct contact between workers' collectives, trade unions, and workers on the one hand, and authorities, governments, and the EU Commission at the European level on the other. Our first two events focused on the labor struggles of delivery workers and care workers, and tonight we will be talking about the situation in agricultural, seasonal, and farm work. And I'm very happy to have Dorothea Biabak-Anon with us, who is a researcher and lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences and Arts in Hildesheim. Her research focuses on the impacts of COVID-19 on international migration and human capital in the context of migration, global governance of low-skilled labor migration, racism, and civil society activism. She uses qualitative research methods, especially discourse analysis and ethnomethodology. And recently she finished her thesis on the governance of seasonal work in agriculture during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our second panelist is Benjamin Luc, who studied economic history, and since 2011, he has worked with NGOs and political foundations on issues of agricultural policy and labor rights. And between 2016 and 19, he lived in South Africa and worked with trade unions and migrant farm worker organizations. And recently, he's employed by the European Migrant Workers Union as a coordinator of the campaign for fair mobility and the campaign initiative for fair farm work in the project for the construction and agriculture sector. Feel very warmly welcomed to be with us, and also you as participants, you are warmly invited to ask questions in the Q&A section, or to let you unmute and to join this discussion. Perhaps some of you, before starting with the first questions, read 2 days ago a Guardian article on the situation of farm workers in Italy, where a farm worker originally coming from Mali died during the hottest hours of the day. And I'm mentioning this as an example of how urgent this discussion is, how urgent it is that the EU and national governments take measures to improve and to protect, to improve the situation of migrant workers and especially farm workers, and not only protect those rights, but also enforce and control those rights, because especially those farm workers in Italy are addressing the issue that even if the authorities prohibited now since 2 days the work between 12:30 and 13 o'clock in the hottest hours of the day, they are afraid that no one will control those measures and that work will be done as usual. Dorothea, as you are here with us, I have a first question to you. You did research on the regime of seasonal labor migration in agriculture in the context of COVID-19. Could you please tell us a bit more of what you did exactly? What did your research consist of, and what were your key findings?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you for the invitation and also for the nice presentation. Yes, so I did research on the regime, which is to say the governance of seasonal labor migration in Germany. So I focused completely on Germany, which of course is not that much an exception because it's included in several EU legislations. And also the COVID pandemic did not only, well, it was not something that Germany could search for a solution itself. So it's obviously embedded in wider developments. But my empiric research was focused on Germany. So I looked at the political discourse on seasonal work in agriculture in Germany during the pandemic, but also several years before the pandemic, because I started from the presumption that it was the moment of the pandemic that seasonal labor migration was actually visible in Germany, which is, I think, different from other countries, where, as you named Italy or Spain, it's for a long time, it has been a public issue, the working conditions and seasonal labor migration in general in agriculture, whereas in Germany, it's rather invisible in society. But the agricultural businesses have been complaining about lacking labor force for several years now. So it was not an exception as it was perceived in the public that now suddenly we lack labor force in agriculture, but it's actually something that has been going on for several years. So what then were my key findings? Were that actually there has been a shift due to the pandemic in the political discourse and in the regime, which was that before the pandemic, seasonal labor migrants only appeared in political discourse as as an economic factor for businesses in terms of labor costs, and overall, if it's possible to employ seasonal workers without social security contributions. And during the pandemic, there was actually a shift that also in political discourse, there were several parties that named working condition issues, and not only the labor union, but also other parties and in the Ministry for Labor. But on the other hand, what did not change is that, and if we look at the regime as a whole, that even though there were more mentions of the working conditions, the measures that have been taken during the pandemic solely targeted the employer's interests in flexibilizing the working conditions. So there is this short-term employment law that makes it possible that seasonal workers can be employed without social security contributions. So this is normally 70 days. And these 70 days, if it's longer than 70 days, employers have to pay social security contributions. And this was extended to 150 days, 15 days. So one could say, well, that's how capitalism works. Of course, there is a high advocacy power of businesses, but I think what is really special is that in Germany, nearly all the seasonal workers are EU citizens. That means that it's actually general German labor law that applies, and this general law is tailored to the exact labor needs of agricultural businesses. And that in change is something that has not only begun in the pandemic, but the same thing has happened several years before, in 2015, when the same law, which was 50 days without social security contribution, was changed to 70 days, also because agricultural businesses said they needed a longer time to employ seasonal workers. So I think that's the biggest finding, that actually general German labor law is tailored to the needs of agricultural businesses of seasonal migrant labor force. And that's not only during the pandemic, but it has happened in the years before. And actually, from my scientific point of view, I talk about that as just-in-time migration, because it's actually making it possible that the exact amount of labor is provided to agricultural businesses the exact time they need it for their season to be completed.
Thank you a lot. Benjamin, Dorothea was talking about these flexibilized employment models and this term of just-in-time migration. How do you, as someone who is working for the European Migrant Workers Union, see the different predominant employment models in the seasonal work sector, and how do they affect the lives of migrant workers?
Yeah, first of all, also thanks for the invitation and the nice introduction. And maybe just shortly, by the way, the name of my organization, MWU, it has union in its name. It was planned as a union. What we're actually doing is we are trade union. We are like led by the trade union IGBAU. We are closely connected to IGBAU as a trade union, and what we do is actually counseling services, legal advisory for the migrant workers in their languages. I think that's also important to understand from which position I speak. We are not a union per se. I do not speak for the union. So yeah, I think our experience is, or first of all, I agree with Dorothea. Clearly, the whole purpose of the scheme that we currently have in Germany, which is really, I would say, unique, also if you compare it to the regimes in other European countries where you have posted workers or where you have predominantly in Southern Europe the problem of undocumented work. Then in Germany, this scheme of so-called short-term employment with the assumption, the legal justification of it, that the work is not done as a real job. So that's like the legal assumption behind it says nicht berufsmäßige Arbeit. This is the unique thing. Of course, the purpose is flexibility, maximum flexibility, which I would nevertheless say we have as a phenomenon globally. We have migrant work in agriculture, particularly in the industrial countries like US, like Western Europe, Australia, but really globally, we have schemes of migrant work, extended recruitment chains, where flexibilization is, of course, the key objective. What does it mean for workers? Clearly, it means precarious life and work for this amount of time that they are there in many respects. When it comes to, for example, labor time, how much do you work per day? We have already now partly extended rules for extended amount of working hours per day for workers. Usually it often goes beyond the 10 hours per day that were supposed actually to be the legal frame for agriculture. So we have phases, of course, where harvesting has to be done for the seasonal workers, and then they simply have to adopt, they have to work extended hours. At the very same time, we have in other regions with other crops, other cultures in Germany, we have Arbeit auf Abruf, which means actually you have, let's say, 40 hours of work in your contract and you want to earn that money. That's why you come to Germany and people really depend on it, on this money. But if there's not enough work to be done, then you are isolated. You often live on the farm, you live in isolation, but you have to wait until the boss calls you to do the work. This is something we observe in practice as well. So it's not just too much work. Sometimes it's also the opposite, which clearly shows, which is one example for this extreme flexibility that we see. And yeah, flexibilization, we could, like we see that in many regards.
Mentioning this work on demand model, that's how I would translate it. How do those workers deal with this situation? How does, in your work at the European Migrant Workers Union, if you have people searching for legal advice, is this a crucial topic, or is other topics more in the focus of their legal advice need?
Well, when it comes to the amount of work and the working time, I think which is important, which is also not just a phenomenon in Germany, but it's globally, I think, the major regime in agriculture or labor-intensive forms of agriculture is that you're paid, in fact, according to piece rate wages, which means you're actually not paid according to labor time that you work and you do what you do. You have this time, you have the security that you're going to get the money, but you're paid according to piece rate, which is a form of disciplining you try to fill, the boxes of strawberries, otherwise you get less money. Now, it's important always to distinguish between the rules and the practice. In Germany, it's clearly the rule is it's allowed to pay according to piece rate wages, but it has to be the legal minimum wage. In practice, what we find often is much more difficult because you're paid according to piece rate wages, and as a worker for you, it's very difficult when you're paid and you get less than you expected, then to prove actually, you have the burden of proof that you actually really work these hours. So it's very tricky. So I think that's an important aspect. People come to, I mean, one thing are the wages. I think you asked for other aspects. Wages, a key problem for workers that they usually do not get the wages which they expected at the beginning. And there are different ways and forms, some legally, some illegal, of deduction. For example, deduction for accommodation, which are often very high, which means de facto deduction from the wage. Then the second thing is, of course, health, occupational health and safety, which is a big issue, particularly in times of Corona. But as Dorothea said, even before Corona, it was a big challenge. Yeah. And then the third thing I would say is accommodation, which is a big problem. And the fourth aspect is, or linked to this, is the problem of lack of social insurance and health insurance that we have.
Dorothea, now we know a bit more about those employment conditions and the problems coming with this. You are especially looking at seasonal work from a migration studies perspective. How would you describe the differences between seasonal migration from other forms of migration?
Yes, so as I said before, I overall empirically looked at the political discourse. So what was really, surprising was that in other discourses on migration, not only in Germany, but there's a lot of research on discourses on migration also in the wider European context. Normally, there's a strong competition between arguments pro-migration and anti-migration. Overall, well, there's of course right-wing argumentation against immigration. There is kind of security issues that are put in place against migration. So in the discourse on seasonal labor migration, there is no objection at all against this migration. So everyone in the political discourse, also the far right-wing party in Germany that is actually normally in favor of closing the borders entirely, during the pandemic, before they didn't really talk about seasonal migration, which is also actually surprising because they always talk about other kinds of migration. But during the pandemic, no one was against seasonal workers to come into Germany to work. And that's also the case before the pandemic. Everyone in the political discourse says we need seasonal migration because there's no one else who can do this work. So this is a very big difference. And it's also a difference that's quite important because in Germany and also in Europe and in, I think, all the Western countries, the migration countries normally want, and the migration policy is targeting in the last years, is high-skilled migration. And in Germany, it's particular because there was actually a law on high-skilled migration that came into force in March 2020 that stated that it's migrants with university degrees or other qualified degrees that should be able to come into Germany. So that was actually a legal term. And of course, seasonal workers do not have degrees. Maybe they might have degrees, but not recognized degrees for the work they're doing. But then there's still the wanted migration. Everyone agrees we need them. So what I think we can see there is that seasonal temporary migration of low-skilled workers is actually the other side of the coin of we need high-skilled workers, because we know, and the government knows in Germany and in other countries, that it's actually, there's a rising need of low-paid workers in unwanted areas like agriculture. But at the same time, there's a very strong political resistance against low-skilled immigration, or immigration in general, of people that have that are not do not have recognized degrees. So this is actually why the low-skilled labor has to be done by seasonal workers, because seasonal workers are not seen as migrants, because they come, they work, they're like pure labor force, because then they leave the country again, and there's no problems for the welfare state, which is the primary argument against other forms of migration, because then there would be costs for integration and costs for reproduction. So there's also Ms. Sadran Nielsen, who have called this kind of migrant labor outsourced labor, because it's low-skilled migration that comes into the country as labor, but there's no low-skilled migrants that actually stay inside the country, because the cost for their reproduction, as we heard, for their health insurances, for their pension rights, actually stay in their countries of origin.
It's a question to both of you, perhaps. Do you have any insights on the differences in labor rights between EU seasonal migrants and third country nationals? How do those situations of those both groups differ?
Shall I start?
Yeah, you can.
Okay. I mean, there is at EU level, there's a specific directive on the rights of seasonal workers from third countries. It's called Seasonal Workers Directive. And it tries to establish the same rights when it comes, for example, to healthcare, which is simply health insurance, which is, for example, denied to all the seasonal workers to a certain degree in Germany. And when it comes to accommodation, and it defines also the principle of non-discrimination for farm workers, also from third countries. I would say when it comes to Germany, per se, it depends on bilateral agreements that Germany has with certain countries. Now with Georgia, for this year, for the first time, we have farm workers, seasonal workers from Georgia based on a bilateral agreement. The agreement tries to establish the same, I would say, low standards when it comes to these workers. What we saw now in first media reports, we also as advisory organizations, also trade union IGBAU is contacted by workers from Georgia, and it shows that they have tremendous problems, are exploited extremely. Also, there were also a couple of media reports in Germany on this. Yeah, so I would say, in general, there are more or less the same standards. Again, now, if you look about how recruitment works in practice, how division of labor works in practice on farms, you see a difference. We have a history in Germany that in the past, most seasonal workers came from Poland. Nowadays, the recruitment chain extended. Now, most of the workers come from Romania. What we see on some farms is that sometimes the Polish workers are the farm workers, so they moved a step higher. They are paid better. They, for example, if they harvest, they get, they sometimes do their work on fields where they harvest more because these are just the more productive fields. While the Romanian guys get the de facto lower wages because they get the more difficult fields to harvest from. So you have these types of creating a hierarchy on the farm, if you want. So, and I think when it comes now to workers from third countries, for them, it might be particularly difficult. And then on top, maybe, which is also very important, is that particularly when it comes to the Ukraine, you have a special situation because there is no bilateral agreement on seasonal work with Ukraine. So what we saw in the last 2 or 3 years is that increasingly students from the Ukraine come based on an internship model. So they are supposed to do internships for their university studies to, to work in Germany on the field. And with this scheme, particularly as they were interns, they didn't even have the right for minimum wage like the other workers. So basically saying there's more vulnerability in a certain way, while on paper, the idea is actually that they have the same standard.
Dorothea, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, so I completely agree with what Ben said, to the complications of third country nationals in Germany, and also on the Seasonal Workers Directive. I think what's important to note there on the difference between third country nationals and EU workers is that actually the EU directive, and also during the pandemic, the EU published several guidelines on seasonal workers. They actually target overall in the Seasonal Workers Directive only third country nationals that come from outside the EU into the EU. So for EU workers, also because in the directive, yes, it's there's established norms for healthcare, etc. But actually, EU workers are they have freedom of movement for workers, and that's kind of on the presumption that they are covered by social security rights because they are citizens of their countries. So that's a problem that EU workers have, because they're not covered by these EU legislations on protection on seasonal workers. But there are, and we know that in practice, as Ben said, a lot of ways to circumvent that while they're working in Germany, they are actually covered by social protection and overall healthcare, which is not actually happening, but the legal and policy tools from the EU do not really protect this group of workers. And now coming to third country nationals, and also in Germany, I think what is also important to know is to note is not only the present problematics that we're actually seeing, but also that for future development of working conditions, we already see that actually, because there is a lack in seasonal workers from the EU, and up to now it was very difficult for third country nationals to work in Germany because there wasn't these kind of bilateral agreements. There was actually kind of a pressure for for attracting seasonal workers, because as Ben said, Poland was the major country of origin. Now there's a lot of Polish that do not work in agriculture anymore. Now it's Romania, but actually it's also already observable that it's less Romanians, or that's like the demand of seasonal workers cannot be covered by Romanian workers. So that actually means that the workers can have more ability to choose where they want to work, or that could be a development. And there's networks between the Polish workers that worked before and that work now, but that's not the case for third country nationals. So they're recruited and they go to special businesses. So it's less of a pressure that if businesses do not treat their workers in a good way, or they actually do not respect the legislations, if there's a good network, it would actually have consequences for these kind of businesses. But if there's now like a big new pool of workers from third countries, this effect is actually lessened. And I think it's as there is very little control of working conditions, it's very dangerous if this kind of network between workers is weakened and does not function anymore as it might have worked. I don't know, like this is something that maybe Ben is more into, because I don't have the direct contact with the workers, but also from a more theoretical perspective of migrant networks, that would be something that is important to know if it comes to opening up new channels for seasonal workers.
Ben, would you like to respond to this, if you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think maybe the last point that Dorothea mentioned, I mean, we as advisory organizations, also the trade unions, are in direct contact with partner organizations in the countries of origin. We have projects together. We even do, for example, Facebook Live events together with the colleagues in Romania, for example, to inform workers about their rights. But what is very important is that both in Romania, particularly last year, I don't know if you remember, in the first Corona wave, when the borders were closed, and then farmers in Germany realized we need our cheap workforce, and then all of a sudden the connection coordinated by planes was organized. So workers from Romania for the first 2 months would be coordinated by the German police and the farmers organizations, by the way, be led to 7 different airports in Germany, and then directly isolated and brought to the farms to work there. And you saw the pictures, you know, in the midst of the first Corona wave, how workers were stuck together in the airport. And this created a huge outcry, if you want, in the Romanian public. And you have a couple of Romanian journalists who would go to Germany, investigate on what's going on the farms, report back in the country. It was a big topic, so that even the labor minister from Romania would visit the German labor minister and complain about what's going on. And only after this, what you see this year is that the labor ministry in Germany really tries to improve the standards and tries to oppose the agrarian lobby that we have in Germany. So that's a big factor, actually, in, I would say, partial small improvements that we see this year. Or what we see this year now with the workers from Georgia is that the workers from Georgia themselves, you know, they would contact the German trade union and say what's going on. And they did videos of their very bad accommodations. It was reported about this in the Georgian media. And even the Georgian trade union would approach the German trade union to try to connect and improve, you know, or connect the struggles to improve the standards. So it's a big factor, actually, particularly through social media, but also to the general media in the countries of origin. Yeah, so I agree with Dorothea, if I understood it correctly, that definitely the networks of these workers themselves is a big factor.
Thanks. Before going deeper into this, you know, concrete practices, how workers, unions, or advisory organizations like yours are trying to improve the situation, I would like to ask Dorothea and you 2 other questions. First, Dorothea, I'm coming from a family, you know, I'm born in Poland, and big parts of my family were in the years between, I think, 1990 and 2005, working on farms in Germany. A lot of them. Later, the whole situation changed, and they went further to Norway, to UK, to Belgium, and other countries. So I'm feeling very much what you said before, how things are changing and how this society and hierarchy is being recreated in different configurations, depending on economic and legal changes. But could you please describe, go a bit deeper into this, how seasonal work in Germany developed historically, and also how this legal regime developed on the EU level, and those changes, how the situation is changing over the last decades, perhaps?
Yes, I can do that definitely, and I think it's important to note this historical development, because of course there have been major changes due to the mobility legislation inside the EU overall, that shifted the regime of seasonal work. But actually in Germany, what is quite interesting is that there's a very long history of seasonal work from Poland overall to Germany, which is also quite interesting, because I think it was something that was not really much known before the Corona pandemic. But then actually it's kind of, I think, a lot of people became interested, and now there's a lot of newspaper articles, but also scientific works that actually dig into this history, which is yeah, I think interesting and good to know that it's come to the fore now, because already before the First World War there was a very big lack of workforce in German agriculture because of industrialization. So the debates that came up were actually not so much different from today's. That there was a lack in population and the rural areas, and they needed workers, and there was also a lot of people who were not willing to go to these areas to do seasonal work. So it was actually a very yeah, functional system that developed of Polish workers coming to Germany in this time, and also a very restrictive legal regime that developed that actually for the first time established that people coming into the German Reich at this time had legally to leave the country again after their work. Also, well, today it's the welfare system that is taken as an argument, and this time it was the national politics of Germanization, because the eastern parts of Germany before had actually been Polish, so the German government wanted to Germanize these parts, and therefore Polish workers had to leave the country after their work. Then there was actually during the wars and overall during the Third Reich, during the Nazi regime, there was the same need of Polish workers, but actually Polish workers were not in Germany in the right amount of time. Actually, a lot of them had left because the situation had worsened. And what happened was that this seasonal work regime that had been in place before the war and before the Nazi regime was kind of yeah, I don't know the word right now, but the system existed, but as they were not workers that would come voluntarily, the German forces actually went into Poland to recruit them by force. There were actually chases of young people to bring them to Germany to forced labor in agriculture. So I think what has to be noted that we can't think about a linear development from before the First World War to now, and of course the situation during and the forced labor migration was very different, but it
I think we lost Dorothea. Am I right, Benjamin? Or so perhaps we wait a moment. So I think we come back to this point as soon Dorothea is back again with us. Benjamin, I would like to ask you the question because Dorothea was mentioning it before. You know, she cannot say much about how this work to support workers in practice actually works from her researcher perspective. and you working as a campaign coordinator for the European Migrant Workers Union and the Initiative Faire Landarbeit, Initiative for Fair Farm Work. Could you please, after Dorothea, who is now back again with us and who could perhaps talk more about what she was speaking about before, tell us, Benjamin, more about how this work you are doing, how do you support workers, and which role does the union IG BAU play in this? Dorothea, are you back with us, or? No, I'm not sure. So Ben, I think it's your turn.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's not so well known, but my organizations, IVW or EMU, and also Fair Mobility, these advisory organizations are actually already an attempt for a response by the trade unions. So as I said before, we are advisory organizations, but we are founded and led by the trade unions. So Fair Mobility, for example, is a nationwide project set up by DGB, by the German Trade Union Federation. And then we have also Arbeit und Leben, many advisory offices at province level. This is actually already, I would say, the first part of my response, that the trade unions understood, okay, we need to provide the responses to very vulnerable, exploited migrant workers, particularly from Eastern Europe, not just in agriculture, but in the meat sector, in the construction industry, in the home care sector. And it's what we offer is of course advice and support for free in the different languages of origin of the workers. Now, what we try to, or what we do in agriculture particularly, as we understood that it's very difficult for us to get in touch by the seasonal workers if we just are working from our offices, because in agriculture people live quite far from the cities, in the rural area, even nowadays often with very bad internet connection, is that that since 2016 I only started working actually recently for these organizations, but since 2016, what IG BAU as a union, the responsible union in agriculture, with the colleagues from IG BAU at the province level, do with the advisory organizations is joint field, coordinated field actions, just in order to get into first contact with seasonal workers. And this is what we basically do in all the provinces in Germany. So what we did last year, for example, was in addition to going to the airports and try to get in touch with the workers there when they arrive, was to coordinate 30 joint field actions. And according to our estimations, we would be able to reach out to 2,500 seasonal workers directly. And the assumption is then they also share the information in the networks. And it's really about, first of all, just informing them about the rights that they have in German in their language with leaflets and stuff like this. And then if the workers are interested in further cooperation, they can contact us through hotlines or whatever, and then we can support them. And then maybe a third very important aspect, which as far as I know is unique in Germany so far, is that IG BAU as a trade union last year launched a new membership model, annual membership model, which is actually tailored, I would say, to the needs of mobile workers, both in construction and in agriculture. So you pay a very low minimum, very low membership fee, and you're just member for 1 year. And what is very important, what you get is support in your advisory and support in your language, but in particularly legal support, legal insurance from day one. And this is, I think, I mean, the point, the piece of puzzle which is often missing, that you as a worker, you know, if you know the rights, if you understand, like, okay, you have this problem on the farm, you should get higher wages, or you whatever, you are harassed by in very worst cases by the management or whatever. You're in a very weak position if you're isolated on a farm in another country, you don't speak the language, and so on. So what this membership model tries to solve is that the union then can support you directly. This is new, and it's of course it's not easy in practice, but this was launched last year. And I would say when we think about, okay, how can forms of empowerment look like, I think this is a very important part of it.
Mm-hmm. So, Dorothea, I think you are back with us. Perhaps, if you like, you could rejoin the discussion on the point you made about the historical development after World War II and in Germany, and of Polish, especially farm workers, and yeah.
Yes, I hope now I will stay with you. And actually, I got a little bit carried away by the older history. I didn't want to stay too long there. But yes, so I think it's actually, there can be like a system observed from overall in Germany, from the dependency in agriculture. This is not like a modern development, because nowadays Germans are not willing anymore to work in agriculture, but it's something that has actually been going on for a long time. And there have been several intentions to activate Germans to work in agriculture. It has been in the Weimar Republic during the between the world wars. It has been now in the 90s and 2005, like government programs in order to bring unemployed people to work in agriculture, but it never worked. So for a long time now, it has been considered a fact, actually, in political discussion, or there has been no political debate anymore, that Germans could work as seasonal workers in agriculture. And that was also visible during the pandemic, that it was directly clear that, okay, maybe some volunteers would help, but it was not actually considered as a solution, that workers from inside the country would do that, which is actually quite a statement about how the conditions in agriculture are perceived. So yeah, that's, I think, a really a continuity for a long time. And then what I wanted to mention on the European level is that there has actually, from the 2000s, when there was a big discussion on a big wave of irregular migration, so discussions on how can we foster or reduce illegalized migration into the EU. There was, I would actually say, a hype on the term circular migration, which is actually often used just as reframing of temporary migration, which is the idea that as low-skilled migration is not wanted, we need high-skilled migration, and we need migrants that do not stay, but that come, work, and then go again. So there was the seasonal workers directives from 2014 actually stems from these political initiatives from the early 2005, more or less, the 2000s. And I think what can be observed is, since then, well, there is a tendency of not only Germany, but in a lot of countries, to look at seasonal work regimes. Also in migration studies, there's several projects looking at best practice policies of circular migration, overall temporary migration, which a lot of countries then look to Spain and their bilateral agreement with Morocco as best practice example, which is actually also to make a little parenthesis, quite disturbing, because actually this agreement is based on the presumption that there is overall Moroccan women that do seasonal migration, because and only women that have family and children, because it is expected that these have the highest probability to go back. So it can be observed, I think, that there is a high tendency to consider seasonal migration and temporary migration schemes as very effective labor migration policies that actually meet the labor demands. It's the classical win-win situation. People from other countries with lower income have an interest, and European labor markets need this kind of work, with workers leaving again. But what is very dangerous, I think, in this tendency or this future perspective, is that there has been now reports from many organizations that point to in par definitionem, temporary migrants are a lot more vulnerable to exploitation, because even if there's legal protection that formally protects them, as we said before, as they have leisure networks, as they actually leave the country after their work, when the wage is paid, when they would have the opportunity maybe to sue their employers legally, they can't, because they're not in the country anymore. If they have a problem with their employer, a lot of times they are bound to the employer. If they don't work there anymore, they lose their resident status. So these problems cannot be protected away by best practice policies, and I think that's something that cannot be forgotten, that the vulnerability of being temporary will not disappear.
Thanks. So we are entering the last part of this event on policy demands. And I think it was you, Dorothea, who mentioned it a while before, that the EU Commission issued several guidelines to the member states in the last year after seeing that the dangers of the COVID-19 outbreak to seasonal workers. And perhaps, Ben, as you see workers on the ground, how's your assessment of those measures after 1 year? Yeah.
After 1 year of what?
After those EU Commission guidelines to seasonal workers, which were published after the COVID-19 outbreak. Yeah.
Okay. I think my feeling, I don't know it scientifically, but my feeling is that in the German context, I mean, these guidelines were part of it, but there were other aspects which were maybe more important to determine the situation. For example, last year in Germany, we had ad hoc Corona rules when it came to occupational health and safety and Corona, the status of Corona for seasonal workers. And this year you had slightly adapted rules defined by German government, but I think the essence of these rules were similar. So, for example, what you had ad hoc last year, and you still have it today as a construction, is that Arbeitsquarantäne, working quarantine, which is a very special construction. I don't know if we have it in other countries, but we have it here in Germany. We had it last year, which meant, okay, like we need some sort of quarantine for the workers, for example, if they enter the country for the first time, because also this year, the countries of origin of the seasonal workers are defined as Hochinzidenz and Risikogebiete by the German government. But at the same time, the workers are supposed to work close in large groups from day one. So in order to have the system, keep the system efficient. So we had this definition of working quarantine, which meant you are isolated from the outside world, but you work in a group. You just stay in the group, not just on the farm, also when you're transported to your accommodation, also in the evening when you're in accommodation, at the very first time when you enter the country. So I think these type of rules defined at national level are extremely important. Or to give another example, this scheme of short-term employment, which effectively cuts you out from, at least this year, cuts you out from large parts of social security schemes in Germany. It's actually directly undermining even the seasonal works directive, which is clearly saying we need health insurance. Health insurance must be there for every worker. In this case, from third countries, but in Germany. So effectively, I feel that so far the laws made on national level are more important in the German context. I think at EU level, I mean, which is one big factor, is this there could have been which is one big factor is actually the agricultural subsidies of the common agricultural policy. So of course, all the producers in Germany highly depend on these subsidies, first of all defined at EU level. Now, something very, very interestingly or very importantly happened last week, and this is in the new round of common agricultural policies, the new round of defining the criteria for the subsidies for the very first time. For the very first time, we did not just have ecological criteria added to the system, but for the first time, we had social conditionality added to the system, which means, very simply said, if you as an employer violate fundamental labor law, then government can take away your subsidies. And this is a demand that the trade unions and the European Federation of Trade Unions had for decades. And it's very important because for the first time you link these subsidies to minimum labor rights. And it came I would say quite surprisingly that it came through. I think currently there's a sort of wrong information in the German media due to a DPA message, which is saying that seasonal workers are cut out from these criteria, which is wrong. What is true is that there is a basis of certain directives, which these criteria are based on EU directives, and the EU Seasonal Workers Directive from 2014 is not part of the basis for this new mechanism. But nevertheless, of course, seasonal workers have the fundamental labor rights in Germany just as all the other agricultural workers. And that's why, it's a small start, but I think this is the right way. Because what we have in Germany is we have inspection authorities, which maybe can find or prove problems at the farm, and then they could, maybe put upon them small fines on the management. But it must hurt, of course. Violating the labor law must hurt the farm, and I think ultimately it could only hurt if you keep away the large EU subsidies. So I think that's an important step, although a small step.
Dorothea, from your perspective, you were mentioning that those kind of best practice policies are not enough, which you mentioned before. What do you think should be done on the national and on the European level? as one of our goals of this project is to publish a series of reports and to establish those dialogues with decision makers involving unions, workers, and so on. So perhaps those policy demands might be a good step to go forward in this process.
Yeah, I think there's maybe policy demands, or in general, yeah, good developments on different levels, because on one level I would agree also with Ben that there's a high need of ensuring that these principles established of protection are actually put into national law, and not only put into national law, but also controlled in practice, which, for example, is in Germany the health insurance, which connects to the social security in general, but actually there has been a very much bigger discussion this year on health insurances for workers than last year when all this came up. So I think maybe not so much in connection to policy demands, but I think what we can actually observe is that the public attention, even though now with 1 year after delayed, has actually more of an impact than, because last year the health, the danger for the health of the workers was very high, maybe higher than now because it was the big wave. But there was not really a discussion about that these workers don't have a health insurance. And this year there was actually a decision that, well, it's not obligatory, but as it has to be that the employers have to inform on the health insurance status of the workers, even though that doesn't apply for this year. And I think it's rather, yeah, maybe a screen decision, but yeah, so I think the public attention really changed, and maybe also that there was a lot of different organizations on EU level, on international UN level that published guidelines on the protection of workers. So I think that does heighten the pressure. So I think that's something that has to be a policy demand, like social security for seasonal workers, yes, without exception. But then the other problem for the temporary migrants in general, I think, is that it has to be critically assessed which works and which work schemes actually are eligible for seasonal workers, because it is possible to make seasonal work arrangements for a lot of different areas of work. And so I think what has to be critically assessed is, or accompanied politically, where new seasonal labor projects emerge, which cut down the possibilities of other workers to actually come to work with a contract that enables them to gain social rights in the place of work. So I think that's not really a demand to say, do that tomorrow, but rather a political tendency and development to observe, and maybe to critique if it is seen that actually there's more and more seasonal work, which makes a bigger amount of migrant workers susceptible to and more vulnerable, which is different if they would be offered a longer-term contract that also enable them to stay in the country, where they then can fight for their rights. So I think this connection between work and legal status in a country is something that always has to be critiqued as the basis of temporary work arrangements, which is in Germany different because the people actually have residence. EU migrants have resident status, but if it's about third country nationals, it's very important to look at how the lacking permanent status makes them more vulnerable to exploitation.
Thank you. Before asking a question from the audience to both of you, Ben, do you want to react to what Dorothea said, or?
Maybe on one point, when it comes to health insurance, my understanding is a bit differently, that actually what the government agreed upon between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats is that they plan to introduce the binding rule that health insurance for seasonal workers must be there from next year on, that it's not voluntary anymore. What it's going to mean in practice is quite clear, that we also already see this now on many farms, is that private health insurance companies in Germany offer specific schemes for seasonal workers, which are very cheap. You pay 15 euro per month for a health insurance for a seasonal worker, and you can apply for these schemes. The employer can apply for the schemes very simply online for a large group of workers. It's very unbureaucratic, very simple, very cheap. And I think this will come next year, or as like a binding thing. And of course, then the question will be, what does it mean in practice? What services are covered and what not? And also, of course, who, so to say, ultimately pays the price? Yeah, will there be ways or tricks to indirectly deduct these 15 euros from the wage or not? So that's actually, I think, the way forward. So I would say yes, compared to having no health insurance this year or last year, this is an improvement. But again, it's a special type of scheme. It's very cheap. It's a bit unclear. It's a bit intransparent. I think that's the way we go. It's a struggle. And in this case, really, it was also a struggle within government. Social Democrats wanted health insurance very clearly. Last year, they ignored the thing. And there is some change. But the Conservative, they wanted to extend this whole model. Yeah, so maybe that's just one point to add. I think that's what we see, very small, sometimes watered down improvements.
So a question to both of you by Mikołaj Solik, who is a participant on Zoom. Are you familiar with the mandate of the European Labour Authority? It is a new agency for enforcing the labor mobility law. How would you see its role in the German context? What sort of best practices or facilitation could it provide? And do you think it could assist the German authorities in organizing joint labor inspections with other EU member states, e.g. countries of origin of seasonal labor migrants? So perhaps whoever wants to start, you can react on this question from Mikołaj Solik. If there is other questions in the audience, I kindly invite you to ask them in the Q&A session in this last 5 to 10 minutes of this event. Thank you.
Shall I start?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay. Yeah, I think ELA as an institution is from like the idea, that role that it should fulfill, it is important on EU level. It's an institution in the making, so I think so far only part of the staff has started the work, and it will grow. If I understand correctly, it has two different types of mandates. The one is sort of information spreading to all involved stakeholders, talking to the unions, talking to the employers and to the different state authorities. With this sort of role of being a sort of information hub or facilitating exchange, that's how I understood it. Maybe I understand it wrong. I would say this is a very soft mandate, and that's definitely not enough. That is, I think institutions in the different countries, if you look at Germany, should have enough capacities to inform themselves properly. I think the second part of the mandate is sort of coordinating. Again, that's how I understood it. The inspection, work with inspection authorities and coordinating between the country of origin and the target country. I think that's really something which is really needed, which is very, very important. Yeah, just imagine, for example, we would have a sort of digital system where states on both sides get certain informations about how much work was done by the worker or what is the social security status of the worker. Just imagine we had a system that is working in that way so that it's very clear, has this person social security in the country of origin or not? And then what kind of system does the person have in Germany? What about the inspection? In other sectors like construction sectors, you have really more problems even with trafficking. There you need, I think, ELA could play a very important role. When it comes to this mandate, I don't know enough to say like how strong is this mandate, or will they effectively be able to have this role. I think, as always with these type of institutions, also governments decide how strong this institution is allowed to be or not. Depends on this.
Yeah, maybe I can react directly. I very much agree with Ben on that it maybe has to be observed how this mandate will develop also in its capacity and ability to actually intervene. But I also see that the coordination and information role on the level between states is maybe one of the most important overall when it comes to social security. And I think in relation to temporary work, overall also to pension rights, because that is something that is really difficult to organize between states. And I think that that's something that has to be developed a lot more between states. And I think the European authority is in a quite central position to also develop best practices on this policy level. When it's, I think the question also directly asked about the control. And there I think it's really difficult because in Germany, for example, and that might be the case in other countries, the control of actually labor protection is in the hand of the districts or the federal states, and then the municipalities. So actually now we already have the problem that that the law that applies cannot be controlled because there's a heavy lack in staff. So I think they actually control the at European level, it will not be able to send actually staff that will control on the ground. And as Ben said, it's a big problem that it's actually it's the legislations that are not put in place in practice because the hours the workers have worked are not registered as it has to be, or they are made to pay for their accommodation, and that's why they don't get the minimum wage. So I think these kind of in frictions which are very heavy on the workers, the European authority has no power to intervene in these kind of controls that I think are very much needed to be able to cut these kind of infringements overall on wages for the workers.
I'd like to have a final statement. Perhaps, Ben, from your side, you could elaborate a bit more on which role should trade unions play in this process of policy making. And Dorothea, from your side, which kind of discursive changes do we need on this path forward as some kind of preconditions to create those policy changes which we and especially agricultural workers themselves long for? Yeah, perhaps Ben, if you like, you could start again here.
Yeah, I think that not just unions, but civil society and also partly government institutions in the country of origin play a key role. What we have, for example, as Fair Mobility is that we have a project with unions and advisory organizations in the countries of origin. So we have a close exchange. Even on individual cases, sometimes there's an exchange. And then also when it comes to the trade unions, they have a European federation and often have members in the countries of origin and in the receiving countries. And I think already there's a lot of support and communication going on, but I think this is a huge potential really to improve the situation. So yeah, I think it's not particularly unions. Yeah, I think what would be helpful for us actually as activists, as civil society, as media in Germany would be to get more information from civil society, media, activists in the countries of origin. Yeah, for example, when colleagues of mine would translate me the reports done by Romanian journalists, when the Romanian journalists traveled Germany for several months, I think 4 months, and would write in-depth stories, the inside stories of the workers, they could get much closer to the workers, their perspective, than the German media. The German media last year talked about asparagus only, and only this year tried to wake up and then now try sometimes, come up with undercover stories, for example. So I think this is not just the unions, I think this is a huge potential. And I think, so with, yeah, civil society, the left progressive movements in Germany, I think it's very, very important to really understand, as Dorothea explained, this history of relations, of exploitations of migrant workers, and of course also the long history of racism in Germany, with a view on people from Eastern Europe. I think that's important, and to get the civil societies closer together in a broad sense. I would include the trade unions there. I think that's the way forward.
Mm-hmm. Dorothea, you have the final.
Yes, maybe on the discursive level, as we said before, I think there has been a shift. Like it was triggered by maybe in Germany or also in other countries, our fruit, our asparagus is in danger, but then actually it resulted in working conditions being more in the media, more an issue. And I think that kind of triggered, it was a trickle down effect to also the political discourse that could not ignore the working conditions anymore, even though the economic needs were still dominating. And so I think it has now to be observed if what we see now, as Ben said in 2021, actually, there was more of an attention to the actual working conditions, if that will continue or if it will disappear again. And what he also said, which I think is very important, that in public discourse, through these videos and reports by the workers themselves, it has been very much more visible how this work is taking place. Workers themselves were more visible, and I think that's also something that might continue in future. That also makes that the workers between themselves also get more activated because they see the publications from others. So I think that social media is changing a lot in the public visibility. But what I think is also important on the discursive level, also there was also one comment in the chat that says that was talking about the UK and then saying it must be okay because they're still coming. And I think that's something that is very dominant in like the everyday public discourse, to say, well, they want it, they are interested because they're still coming. And of course, I think it's very important that also discursively the bigger system of wage differences, that also of first wage differences, and second restrictive residence laws that make it for certain people only possible to come as seasonal or temporary workers, is not forgotten. That of course that people are interested in these kind of works does not mean that this is best practices. It means that the wage differences and the precarious situations of migrant workers are still that high that they do still see these kind of work conditions as an option, which does not mean that these conditions are the best or the way they should be. So I think that's also something that should change, and that might also change due to these developments that made the actual conditions more visible in the last time.
Ben and Dorothea, I'm very, very thankful for this very insightful discussion with both of you. And I also want to thank all of the participants with us on Zoom and on the live stream on social media, and our partner, Another Europe is Possible, who was hosting this event. As I said before, we are planning a series of other events on different sectors of workers and also of reports, and bringing workers and unions and NGOs together with decision makers. And I'm very, very hopeful this process might, exactly lead to those changes in the next years or decade to come, which you mentioned before. And as we reach the end, I'm gonna wish you a nice evening, a beautiful summer, and a lot of hope for political change. So thank you a lot for being with us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And please organize more of these kind of events.